Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 20, Section 3, and that is the business of America. Because another one of Coolidge's quotes was, the business of America is business. And we'll be talking about how consumer goods, that are things that are made for consumption, things like iPhones, of course, weren't around back then, but clothing, appliances, tools, things you want to buy. These are consumer goods. And these fueled the business boom of the 1920s. The economy of the 1920s was actually rather strong for several reasons we'll look at today. And one of the positive benefits of a strong economy, obviously, is a rise in the standard of living, meaning that the quality of Americans' lives were improving. First, a little about Calvin Coolidge. As President of the United States, he favored minimal government interference in business. The extreme end of this is called laissez-faire, meaning hands-off, where the government took no role in business whatsoever. It was the belief of some that the free market would be a self-regulating phenomena, that if a business charges too much for a product, people will choose not to buy it. That business must lower the price of its product to be competitive, and that benefits the consumer. And in a perfect world, capitalism is supposed to be self-regulating. And so he hoped to allow private business to flourish. So this would be a conservative view of economics.
As governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge's efficient handling of a Boston police strike and his defiance of labor leader Samuel Gompers gained him national attention. He was chosen as Warren G. Harding's vice presidential running mate. The Harding-Coolidge administration began at the height of the post-World War I boom. With his hearty, robust manner, Harding dominated the Washington scene, totally overshadowing Vice President Coolidge. But on August 3, 1923, the nation was shocked by Harding's sudden death. Immediately after Harding's death, the vacationing Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as president by his father, a county judge in Vermont. Silent Cal, as he was called, put in place economic policies that promoted the growth of American business. Along with his almost entirely new cabinet, he supported minimal government, reducing the national debt and providing as little government as possible at the lowest possible price. His constructive economy won the overwhelming approval of Americans. Coolidge had to deal with the Teapot Dome scandal that the Harding administration had left behind. Living up to his reputation as a simple, honest man, he set up a special counsel, and as a result, several high officials were forced to resign. It's ironic that this honest, hard-working, thrifty man led the nation during the glittering, roaring 20s, a time of many excesses. The public was pleased with this down-to-earth leader and gave many honors to him and his wife, Grace. It was no surprise that in 1924 he earned the presidency in his own right from satisfied voters. His economic policy was good for American business, including show business. But while Hollywood boomed, farmers faced hard times caused by low prices and worldwide surpluses. Coolidge twice vetoed bills allowing the government to buy surplus crops. Coolidge reluctantly did his share of publicity. In the Black Hills of North Dakota, the Sioux named him Chief Leading Eagle. But soon the president returned to matters of state. In 1928, to the astonishment of millions, Coolidge made his classic statement, "I do not choose to run." Deeply affected by the tragic death of his son from an infection, he decided to leave public life. Former Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover won the GOP nomination and was elected. The peace and prosperity enjoyed by the nation under Calvin Coolidge would not return for decades.
So, American industries. There was a president that was very much pro-business at this time, and there were several entrepreneurs that thrived in this economy. most famous of which is Henry Ford, who developed the mass production assembly line technique to build not the first automobile, but the first affordable automobile, the famous Model T. We'll look at video of it in just a moment. This became the industry standard for automobile production, and that is each worker doing a small piece of a larger, more complex product. And obviously, automobiles have changed life as we know it. From roads merely being graveled or dirt, now automobiles created the necessity of paved roads, where there were no gas stations before because they weren't necessary. They weren't profitable because only the very wealthy could afford automobiles. Now that everyone can afford one, gas stations are going to appear everywhere. Motels. More people will be able to travel, therefore there will be a necessity for people to stay somewhere warm. And motels will become a profitable business, as well as shopping centers. Now with increased mobility comes a consumer demand for products that meet that specific need. And so this gives it an increased mobility to everyone, not only families, but now women can travel more safely, more efficiently. Young people can experience greater mobility, and it does. It changes life. Now, we live in an interesting time where you can still find elderly people that remember life before the automobile. My grandmother is 97. She remembers clearly her first car. They were loading up in Chattanooga on a covered wagon to travel up to the mountains where she grew up. And on her way out of the city, she saw her first automobile. And she still remembers it as a big event. And she even told me about it over Christmas. Now, this allows people to live further from their jobs. I currently live 15 miles from here. It would not be possible for me to work at this school if there were no automobiles. I live up on a mountain. It just wouldn't be practical. So this allows people to live further from their work. Now, in urban areas where we're dealing with large numbers of people, this would still be considered a rural community, but in a larger city, this actually affects the shape of the city. And this is a term called urban sprawl. As people desire to live further out from the city and commute into the city, the desirable places to live in a city are called the suburbs. That is the area outside the city. Now, the auto industry becomes the economic base for a lot of these cities. Again, it becomes the economic base for a lot of these cities. In fact, by the 1920s, 1 out of every 5 Americans own an automobile. This does several things to the economy. Number one, it boosts the oil industry. Prior to the Second World War, America was the largest producer of oil globally. In fact, when we cut oil sales to Japan in the 1930s, it threatened to cripple their economy and slow their war efforts. So this gives strength to the oil industry. The auto industry becomes essential to the American economy. In fact, in 2008, when the big 3 auto producers in Michigan were on the verge of collapse, the federal government bailed out the automakers, giving them a huge loan so they wouldn't go under. Because if the auto industry goes under, still today, if the American auto industry collapsed, our economy would go into a depression. So it is still an essential industry in the United States. Of course, same with oil. And we have reached a point in our country's history where we are once again nearly independent. We now produce more oil than we import. And that is a new phenomenon which has happened in the past 10 years.
How is this supposed to work?
When the first automobiles were produced, only the well-to-do could afford them. But before long, people who lived in the country became the first large-scale group of car owners. There were plenty of railroads and streetcars in the cities, but trucks now enabled rural farmers to bring their goods to market faster. Tractors helped them to run their farms more efficiently, and cars enabled them to travel more often. Soon people living in the country didn't feel so isolated from the rest of the world. Wherever people have easy access to automobiles, cars play a major role in social life and a choice of recreational activities. People found it fun to hop in the car and visit friends and relatives, whether the drive takes a few minutes, hours, or days. As roads improved and car ownership expanded, this freedom enabled more and more people to move to the suburbs and get better jobs. By the mid-1950s, even factories had begun to relocate closer to the suburbs to accommodate their workers. Most of the conveniences we have taken for granted today probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for the automobile.
Now, the amazing thing here, and what the Wright brothers were able to capitalize on, is the internal combustion engine. Now, this engine had been around for, a few years at this point, and the question about the airplane was to design a light enough engine that still propelled, that still provided the necessary torque, but also to design big enough wings that could utilize the torque to produce the lift necessary to carry the weight of an engine and a passenger. And that's where the Wright brothers excelled. They were bicycle mechanics from Ohio. They tested their craft at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and they only flew for a few seconds, but they demonstrated that the physics were possible. And within a few years, there were commercial airplanes, there was an airmail service, and even by the First World War, airplanes were used in combat. Now, they weren't extremely maneuverable, they weren't extremely fast, but they were useful for reconnaissance and even, in some cases, dropped small bombs on the enemy. And there were even primitive dogfights. The Germans developed a technology allowing the machine gun to be placed behind the propeller so that the pilot could line up his gun with the front of his plane. And it had a motion sensor on the front of the gun so that when the propeller passed by, the gun would fire and it would work perfectly with the timing so that it would only fire between the propellers. Quite brilliant, and allowed for the earliest dogfights. Now, the airplane industry, again, started as a mail service for the post office. But planes have been useful in weather forecasting. Planes have even now been equipped by this time with radios and navigation tools. And Pan American was the first offering commercial flights. And as we talk about Charles Lindbergh a little later, we'll also learn about how the transatlantic flight was first achieved. Now, transatlantic means that you could now buy a ticket and fly a plane across the ocean. Next, on to America's average standard of living. The average annual income rose over 35%, up to now $705 a year. Which at this time, the point is that your income goes up by 35%, which is extremely significant. I've not experienced a raise to this degree in my entire career. 35%. Not even over the 10 years I've been teaching have I experienced a raise and 35%. That's astounding. And so during the 1920s, we're talking about a real significant increase in the standard of living. What would I do with this kind of raise? Well, number one, I would pay off some debt, which would be awesome. My wife's student loans, small things that we still owe. Oh my gosh, it would be amazing. But what else would I do? So once I've paid off some debt, and now that I have a little extra income, well, we might do more things for fun. We might be talking about a bigger vacation, maybe Europe someday.
You could buy your class iPads.
Yeah, well, I mean, you guys have these cool Chromebooks, but we might buy, what would you buy if you had this awesome raise? Now, 35% is huge. Okay, so I might buy more luxuries, maybe more conveniences for the home. There's that cool Nest thermostat thing that makes your home like a smart home, which I think is so cool. I might finally buy a smartphone. Luxuries and conveniences. So what types of luxuries and conveniences were Americans buying at this time? Well, big one. I know we think this is kind of silly and outdated, but a big convenience was electricity. Oh my gosh. In the 1920s, Americans were able to electrify their homes because a new technology developed by Nikola Tesla, the alternating current. And that is that power could be utilized in an efficient way, and where it wasn't being used in one home, it could alternate and be used in another home. It created the electrical grid. And this allowed the technology of electricity to be given to the average consumer. More homes began utilizing electrical appliances. And so now that homes have electricity, people are buying appliances with this extra money. Simple things such as a washing machine, or a clothes dryer, or a refrigerator, or a toaster, or an oven. Things that we so take for granted, but were revolutionary. I mean, for one, of course, we're still talking about a culture here where women do most of the housework, and these appliances allow women to have more free time. And now that people can have more free time, well, of course, what are we going to do with this free time? And so it actually creates a social phenomena where more women are able to work outside the home. So new technology was a step towards social equality. Also, I mean, gosh, I've said this several times now, but a 35% raise, I can't imagine that. I mean, I get excited just thinking about what would I do with this kind of raise. I don't know. It's just cool to think about. You're going from barely getting by to suddenly, wow, okay, now I can actually buy some things. Now I can actually do some things I've always wanted. And so what am I going to spend that money on? Well, it depends on what my interests are. And then within those interests, I'm going to read about the newest products. And I'm going to be sold by some advertising. I'm going to see an ad for the coolest new iPhone. I'm going to want that one because I've got extra money to buy it. Well, at this time, advertising agencies began to hire psychologists to learn how to appeal to the public. Now, of course, Mad Men was set in the 1960s, but it's based on this premise, and you got to watch the show sometime. It's on Netflix. Really interesting show, all about how to use psychology to appeal to a person's desire to buy a product. How do you endeavor to create a demand? For example, a new product at the time, Listerine, a mouthwash. No one had ever used mouthwash prior to Listerine. No one had heard of it. No one had even really thought about it. Bad breath was just the assumption. It was kind of the norm. And so when they advertised the product saying, we'll cure bad breath, what advertisers were able to realize is that's not enticing enough. That's not going to create enough demand. Bad breath, oh, well, we just always had that. So what Listerine did was invented a term called halitosis, which I assume is Latin for bad breath. But since they used a scientific term, well, now it sounds medical. Well, now it's a medical condition. Oh, my bad breath is halitosis? You mean it's caused by bacteria buildup in the mouth, and that can be cured through the use of mouthwash? Oh my gosh, I better get this for my family. It creates a sense of urgency. Also, brand name recognition. And even in the post-television era that we live in, where we all get our media through devices, Netflix, internet, etc., we're not as subject to television advertising, which really they weren't either. We're not yet to the age of the television in the 1920s. However, radios were becoming more popular. We'll talk about that a little later. Newspapers were a powerful form of advertising. Billboards, powerful form of advertising. And the goal of advertising agencies was to create a familiarity with their product. We've got to put it everywhere. We've got to create symbols for products so that when you see that symbol, like the golden arch, you associate it with McDonald's. Good. Now, also, business people endeavor to create a good feeling about their product. Why? Because they want you to feel that when you buy their product, you're also helping the larger community. And so businesses will engage in philanthropic activities. Like you buy a Big Mac, they'll give a penny of that to the stopping of clubbing of baby seals or something. So you buy a Big Mac, you get to be a part of helping to stop the clubbing of baby seals. I don't know, whatever. Some kind of thing that's going to encourage you to feel good about the money you're spending. And so that creates a feeling that by buying a product, you're not just serving yourself, but you're actually helping change the world. Now, the 1920s were a prosperous time. The average standard of living was going up. This was boosting consumer demand, and it created this feeling of prosperity. Productivity was increasing because wages were up. Businesses were expanding, not only consumer businesses, but key industries because of an increased demand for many essential goods, such as steel for the automobile industry, coal, now that we're using more energy, and electricity, obviously, and oil for automobiles. So these key bedrock industries are experiencing significant growth, and this is trickling down to the average American. And so people believe this prosperity is going to last forever. Chain stores develop to meet this consumer demand, meaning that stores become successful enough to the point they're able to expand at an exponential rate, become national brands. National banks. A bank exists when people need to save and invest money, and when more people are doing this, then banks grow. And so banks are going to grow in power, and small branches are able to become national branches. But what we also see is, where is most of this prosperity going to? And that's called the income gap. That much of this prosperity is going to the very wealthy. And this creates an income gap between workers and managers. We're not quite at the level of income gap that we are now, where CEOs often make 400% of what their workers do, which is the environment we live in today. But that movement, that gap is growing during this time as well. Now, an underlying problem showing evidence of a superficial prosperity was that though these key industries were growing, they were not as prosperous as would be necessary to sustain this growth. The point is, we're looking at a bubble where these things are growing faster than they should. And that's an unhealthy sign in an economy, something we'll explore later with the Great Depression. Also, some of these industries are already experiencing losses during the 1920s, such as the farming sector. And some of that was due to the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy. Another evidence of weakness, even during an economic prosperous time such as the, quote, roaring 20s, is consumer debt. Now, consumer debt is a measure of a bubble. It's evidence. You see, many of these products, such as an oven or an automobile or a new home, are rather expensive. And some of these are too expensive for us to pay cash on. And so we buy these goods with an installment plan. Now, credit, you have the right to go into debt even as young as you are. You could go out and you could get a credit card in your parents' name and you could begin to acquire debt. It's a rather scary prospect. I encourage you to avoid it as long as you can. I did not have any debt until I finished grad school. So not until my mid-20s did I get my first product on an installment plan, and that was my first car. But like most Americans, eventually you're going to want something that you can't afford with cash. And so you're going to buy something by paying for it over an extended period of time with interest. Banks provide money at low interest rates. Credit cards provide money at much higher interest rates. However, in the 1920s, some people began to point to the fact that there was excessive borrowing going on. And yes, this is a fundamental weakness. Now, the scary thing is when we're looking at consumer debt, you're tracking what individual people are doing with their money on a large scale. So you can't predict that. You can't control that. There are some things that can be done now with the Fed raising and lowering interest rates to control the level of borrowing that people do. But at this time in the 1920s, those controls weren't there. And so there was little that could be done. And so people were borrowing money and borrowing too much of it. And of course, you know what happens when these things bust.